All right, welcome back, everybody, to the Summer of Protocols Protocol Town Hall, a guest talk series focused on protocols and protocol research from the Summer of Protocols. You can find out more about the Summer of Protocols, the research, the program calendar, along with information about the protocol kit at summerofprotocols.com. In today's guest talk, we will be speaking with Benjamin Funk. Benjamin is an analyst at Archetype, a crypto venture firm where he focuses on research into mechanism design and futuristic online applications. Today, he'll be talking about a recent train of thought that has been exemplified in the pre reading material entitled Crypto Powered Information Games, which explore how decentralized systems can harness information for new economic models and applications. So, with that, I will pass it over to you, Benjamin, and you can take it away.
Sounds great. Thanks a lot for the introduction, Josh. Hey, everyone. Unfortunately, I cannot see all of your faces on the screen today, but I'm really excited to be presenting to you some of my ideas and thoughts that I've been accumulating over the past months, maybe years. Maybe just a quick context on myself first. As you already know, my name is Benji, and I work on the investment team at a firm called Archetype, which is an early stage investment firm. And I got into crypto because there are a couple of topics that I hold really close to my heart. Um, Specifically, I've just always been interested in how can we create more sustainable economic models, financial models, technological models for people to live happy lives that are fulfilled. How do we create technology that is resistant to authoritarianism? And all of these interesting things all brought me to the crypto space. Um, I initially spent a lot of time on things like exchange design and MEV. Um, and I think that was actually one part of the rabbit hole here, specifically around MEV mitigation. I got very interested in programmable information disclosure and how they can be used to solve some of the negative externalities that happen on Ethereum supply chain. And the Ethereum cause is something that's very important to me. Um, that also led me down another rabbit hole, which was just okay, if the way we disclose and conceal information is at the heart of how MEV works, how can I apply it to all these other topics that I'm really interested in? Is there something here to be unlocked on how we produce, monetize, and consume information? Is this something we can tackle at a protocol level? Um, and so I was watching actually this talk from Robin Hanson, which I assume some of you at least will be familiar with. Um, and his big talk on prediction markets and what he calls decision markets, which is essentially just leveraging prediction markets to make good decisions. And he had this big talk about how, since he's invented prediction markets, nobody has quote unquote taken the gold. Nobody has taken the gold of leveraging these tools he was so proud of to then make better decisions as organizations, as humans. We're not actually using these epistemic tools to make better decisions. And at the end of the day, that is the gold, right? If we can all collectively make better decisions, then we should be able to unlock a market on the scale of global GDP. It is quite literally like a subcomponent of efficiency and output that is at the core of that metric. So I was tackling this very broad question, that is interesting. We haven't really created many protocols and tools for solving that problem. And so I set about to explore these questions. And I realized that maybe one interesting lens to look at it and to approach it would be to look at a supply chain centric view of the information supply chain. And I think in terms of how relevant this is and how it expands to the concepts beyond MEV and exchange design, which are important, but not the most important, I would say, topics of our day, which is that right now, our supply chain is quite broken. The way we produce and monetize information is dominated by what one of my favorite authors likes to call surveillance capitalists, the Googles and the Facebooks of the world. I don't feel the need to go into too much depth to explain how big of an issue here. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir around privacy. But I do think it is important to shift to a lens of the supply chain here, in the sense that the way that Google collects, produces information about us is not really aligned with what us as humans actually want to consume. The information that we produce that is then used by politicians and lawmakers to enact policies and change. And that this entire information supply chain and the predictive information that it produces is controlled to actually modify our actions, and we lose sovereignty in that regard. And the fact that companies like Google and Facebook not only get to know about us more than we know ourselves, but decide who decides what we actually do seems like a fundamental problem. So I want to be tackling some of these topics in the presentation today. And really, what this is for me, and the reason why I wanted to talk with all of you today, is to actually get some help. Because I feel like I've gone to the point where I've constructed these models of the information supply chain and where we could go forward from here to solve things like misinformation and bad governance. But I feel like I'm lacking on some additional information and steps forward. And so I'd like you all to help me on this journey today. So yeah, I think that there's room for new protocols, and in some cases, new applications, not necessarily protocols. But I think that like at the key, let's say, drawback of the conversation so far around things like surveillance capitalism and like bad decision making and governance is that we don't work backwards from the demand side, right? We cry to implement privacy into our systems, but we don't actually work backwards from what the people consuming information actually want and how we can orchestrate the protocols around that. And so that's what I'm going to be attempting to do today. And if we look at the information consumers, they want to do something that maximizes their outcomes, to make good decisions and allocate resources positively. And I would say the really simple framing for that would be to separate information consumers into three parties: governing bodies, right? Whether they're governments or DAOs, they have this resource that is credibility, and they can expend that resource through, electing, decision makers, implementing policies, each of which might or might not be credible over the long run. But this is something that is critical for them to preserve. And so any information they consume are dedicated towards allocating that resource effectively. And I would say for businesses, that is likely to be long-term profitability, and that the resource that they expend to achieving that is capital, right? Financial and human. At the end of the day, the information that they consume towards that end, is used to predict whether or not a person will be a good hire, or some capital expenditure on a plant in South Africa will be worth it. And then finally, on individuals, a good life. And this is deliberately high level, not to go into the philosophical depths. But at the end of the day, we have time, energy, and a bank account. And that is a resource that we have. And, we get suggested information on what we should buy and who we should talk to. And we eventually end up spending that resource. This is what I want to work backwards from to get to the answer of, can we build new protocols here? And I think a very high level framing of what the information production part of the supply chain looks like today is we have a bunch of public and private data that lives inside our brains and databases. And we put them through these manufacturing processes, right? Primarily, these are markets and algorithms, and quite frankly, predominantly algorithms, right? Whether or not those algorithms are basic and statistical in nature and used within the context of research at a university, or whether or not they are artificial intelligence algorithms used to suggest to us the things that we should buy online. Hypothetically, we could also leverage markets to produce information. It's just that we don't do that as intentionally as we would. But I think this is where the prediction market discussion comes in and something that I will tackle on later into the presentation. These production processes all go into making two goods. One of them I'll call empirical information goods. And so these empirical information goods, let's call them quantitative and qualitative data that is collected through observation, measurement, and experimentation. Oftentimes, they're also an input into this manufacturing process. And they can go into producing another type of information good, which I'm going to call probabilistic. And TLDR, probabilistic information in this framing, is just something that is an inference about the future and uses historical data to extrapolate what the future might be. And I think to tie this all together into a supply chain of information production, collection, and consumption, typically information consumers start with a question, right? As I decide what's the best decision to make given my resources, a hypothesis on, what a good expenditure of resources would be. And then there are these information producers and monetizers that produce these intermediary predictive goods, which are information indicating potential future states on individual and collective actions and preferences and beliefs, as well as predictive information about the world around us. Have this fun little example below for you guys to kind of put this into concrete concepts. And typically those information producers leverage the collection of raw materials on empirical information, right? Which we'll call in this case past and present states. Past and present states on these same things, right? Individual and collective preferences, beliefs, actions about on the world around us. This is, I think, the framing for how the process works so far. And I think that with this framing in mind, we can go to explore how we might actually improve the supply chain here. Now, one point on monetization, right? The step between this intermediary predictive good that is produced, let's say, as an example, by the likes of Google, and how they might then go to monetize that information towards an information consumer. The problem with information monetization and the ways that companies like Google actually go about to get around it is that information is a complicated good to monetize, which is that it's hard to monetize it without keeping it confidential. And there are a couple of characteristics economically of information that give it this property. One of which is that it can only be valued after its consumption, which makes it hard for buyers to assess whether its price accurately reflects the value. And then it's also non-rivalrous in that its consumption actually doesn't reduce its availability. So there's no notion of scarcity. The third property of information that makes it difficult to actually monetize is that it's non-excludable. And so you might have gone over these points in the piece, but if you haven't, that just means that it's hard for sellers to prevent unauthorized access. These are the typical factors that lead to market failure in the monetization of information, that actually leads to an underproduction of information. So, okay, how has Google gotten around that? Again, a little bit discussed in the piece, but they go about by selling the right to take actions based off of the information. And the way that they do that is by controlling the platform under which users consume information. But there are also other ways that we can monetize information that might actually solve this market failure. And so I think this is an interesting part of creating new protocols that we should explore, which is that, like, if we can solve the market failure at the monetization level, then how might that actually lead to new production? So a classic example is you can monetize information by creating a product that allows people to speculate on how it will change. I think there are a couple of great examples of crypto protocols that have successfully done this and actually created entirely new, higher quality sources of information. One of them being a portfolio company called Parcel that makes a better index for the case Schiller. So a better index of prices of real estate across the United States. And the only ways that they could go and do that is by generating the fees from allowing people to speculate on how those real estate prices would change. The other one is classic, right? Restricting access to private consumption. Expert networks are a perfect example of this. They have to restrict the people that have access to this expert confidential information to be able to monetize it. And then the Google style monetization that I talked about, I think is interesting to explore further along this definition, because you can actually recreate the same properties of Google monetization with things like MPC, TEEs, and FHE. Specifically, the fact that you can use these cryptographic methods to secure credible commitments about the computation that buyers will take on top of the private data that producers might actually have, might be a way to disrupt a protocol here. And that's my intuition, and we'll explore that in a little bit more depth later on. But I'm actually quite excited about that primitive. But I want to explore in further depth today is what kind of experimentation have we actually done in crypto land so far along these lines, and what can we learn from them, and what better models can we create? So if the objective here is using these resources to make good decisions and consuming information to that end, then one framing of how we might be able to achieve that is to use the concept of Shannon's entropy. And this is actually a term that I borrowed from a good friend, Connor, who's actually gone through the Summer of Protocols program, and who is developing a very interesting system that we'll go into depth about. He suggests this idea for like Shannon's entropy being the perfect model for assessing the type of information that is worth paying for on the part of an information consumer. And so, quick overview of Shannon's entropy. Shannon's entropy is a formula for measuring the uncertainty in a system. It's also a high-level framework. And if we assume that reducing entropy, right, which is technically reducing uncertainty, improves our understanding of the world and our ability to make decisions, then we should use that as a model for deciding what the best information production vehicles are. And so I think there are two things that really reduce entropy, one of which is based off of our model of the world. So our model of the world is, the knowledge and beliefs and assumptions and expectations around how things work. The only thing that get us to change our model of the world, and hence reduce entropy significantly about things that are going to happen in the future, is to collect surprising information. Because surprising information is the only thing that signals that there is a flaw in our model. The other part of it that is relevant is consequential information. So consequential information reduces entropy because it helps us assess what is going to significantly affect an outcome towards our collective preference. So consequential information helps us make better decisions that align with what our collective preferences are. But to derive what our collective preferences are, we need some way to construct a model of ourselves and what our goals are, what we really want to achieve. So this is going to be important for assessing some of the crypto protocols that are trying to improve the way that decision making happen today. So yeah, as I've gone to explain, these governing bodies need better resource allocation and better information production, and they essentially need an oracle for what we need to do. And I want to break down the components of this oracle. So its output should be what do we do, right? That is consumed by the information consumer. And as an input, it needs predictive information about what states could be in the future, right? And that really is dependent on our model of the world. It also needs another input, which is subjective information. What are the states that we actually have preferences about? And that is fully a function of our model of ourselves. And so this oracle would ideally have to construct some sort of consensus on our preferences. And then to further complicate things, that oracle would need sub-oracles, specifically on predictive information on like what states could be, right? That goes all the way back to this model. This supply chain over here is entirely centered around deriving what states could be. And so that's where markets and algorithms can play a role. And I think where most of the experimentation in crypto has really existed so far is like, okay, how can we create permissionless markets and new types of algorithms that work better on crypto rails that can produce this predictive information? But I want to highlight here is that that is just a subcomponent of the oracle that we need, right? It helps us produce this predictive information on what states could be. And that's important towards acting based off of our model of the world, but we still need to service the states that we actually have preferences about and come to consensus on that to create the perfect decision-making vehicle. And I do think that blockchain's cryptography can play a role here. Now let's go through some case studies. And this took me a little bit of time to all fit within this model. But I think EigenLayer is a perfect example in that it really is an oracle for what we should do, right? We have, specifically, I'm talking here about the EigenLayer token that got released, I believe maybe a month ago. And this EigenLayer token is all about like, how do we identify these like intersubjective faults, right? So far, we have Ethereum, which is great at identifying attributable faults, right? Has a validator double signed a block. And that's very easy to detect within Ethereum's decision-making machine and its consensus protocol, but it's not very good at identifying intersubjective faults, right? So a good example of an intersubjective fault would be, let's say that I'm a market maker, you have a market maker, and you have an exchange. If you have two market makers and let's say like 5 market makers, and you have an exchange, and all of a sudden one of the market makers decided to bribe the exchange and said, hey, if you could, manipulate the latency for the other players and not mine, then I'd pay you a little bit of money. Now, if that happens, right, all the other validators could tell that, okay, when the price of an asset went up significantly, all of our latencies went down by a certain percentage. But there's no way for me to blame that on the exchange if it was bribed onto the protocol, because that latency change could have been a function of a networking problem, right? And there's no way for me to attribute that fault that occurred to a specific malicious action that the exchange operator followed. And so EigenLayer's token is designed and set up to help people come to consensus on what kinds of like intersubjective faults might have happened. But it's not designed to identify subjective faults, right? And so they even lay this out in their white paper. Predict like what will the price for an NFT be in 1 year? You can't use the EigenLayer token to do that. And so what I want to point out here is that we have to relax our assumptions about going back to our model of the oracle. We have to relax the assumptions here about how perfect this is in terms of a decision-making process. Because in EigenLayer, the model of the world for what is a fault is fixed. And I think the best way to break this down in terms of the actual technical design of EigenLayer is by kind of like explaining how it works. So let's go through an example. Validators stake a B eigen token into a contract to join a decentralized Oracle network. And if a group of validators controlling, let's say, 30% of the staked tokens reports a false, significantly higher price for an asset to benefit their own position in some way, then the community can gather in a Discord and initiate a challenge. To do so, they have to choose a respected community member to act as a challenger and start a forking process. And the challenger essentially creates a new fork of B eigen 2, with rules specifying that the colluding validator should be slashed. They also post a bond to show that they've committed to challenging this malicious actor. And B eigen 1 is frozen, and the incentives to participate to choose the right ledger and that to slash the malicious validator is occurring because during the redemption period, holders who believe in the challenge can redeem B eigen tokens by proving that they hold B eigen 1 tokens, and so that they can essentially have this period of time here, and this shows in this like bottom diagram, where the honest parties can essentially decide to stake behind this new fork, and the malicious operators tokens that get locked can essentially then get burned and redistributed to the honest parties that have selected the right choice. But the problem with this model is, again, that the model of the world for what is a fault is fixed. So there's a fixed threshold for what is considered a legitimate fault. And the assumption for what is a fault, what is like a fault, can change, right? The eigenlayer AVS might end up having more economic security at stake. The failure of said AVS could end up leading to more destructive damage. But in the setup phase of the AVS, you actually need to determine a fixed percentage of eigen tokens that must be slashed for faults to be considered legitimate in the setup phase. And so I think that just like speaks to the fact that like this isn't a perfect oracle for what decisions to make. And I think that there's other examples of like governance experiments that have different flaws as well. So I think in optimism, one of the core drawbacks and why it's not a general purpose oracle for decision making is that it assumes a preference function about what projects are the ones that we actually want to fund. So maybe a quick overview of optimism and how it allocates resources is they operate on this core principle of retroactive public goods funding, which is that it's easy to agree on what was useful in retroactively than what will be useful in the future. And so what they do is they have this interesting allocation mechanism that I won't go into into much depth about, that is allocates OP tokens to worthy projects. However, the people that are elected to actually make those decisions and allocate tokens are a function of a committee. So there's a committee that decides who has the right to allocate tokens to all these different projects. And that is a centralized process. It assumes that there is a preference function around what kinds of projects we actually want to fund that is fixed. And we see how this can turn out for the worse, right? In the past, optimism purely wanted to focus on public goods, right? But it's since expanded its mandate to other types of goods that aren't necessarily public goods. And so that preference function of the community has changed, and that's fine. But the problem is this mismatch where OP is technically somewhat controlled by the broader community. But at the end of the day, the judges that make the decisions over what kinds of projects you can actually allocate to through this RPGF mechanism is more centralized than that. And so what I would say about optimism is that as an oracle, it's doesn't fully capture the preference function of the entire optimism community. And technically, the OP token should actually represent the entire preference function of OP token holders. So that's a problem there. They have an interesting mechanism where markets play an interesting role in advancing the payment, despite the fact that decisions on who to allocate funds to are agreed upon retrospectively. And so the way that actually works, just to go into the depth of the mechanism because it's interesting, is that there's this results oracle, right? Essentially just a judge that uses its funds to set a price floor for the token. And if it allocates a reward of a certain amount of money and the project has a total supply of tokens, then it publishes an open order to buy up the entire supply of those tokens at a price of X, the reward that they've allocated, over N, the amount of the token per token. And so there's essentially this funding mechanism that occurs by setting a price floor that allows the oracle to reward the project multiple times. Moving on to MetaDAO, which is actually an interesting experiment of futarchy. Again, it doesn't follow the perfect generalizable oracle that I set up in this slide for what we actually need, because it has these core problems of not surfacing surprising information, right? And I want to dig in deeper to this concept of surprising information. I think the ideal oracle needs surprising information because breakthrough paradigm shifting insight requires expensive moonshot ideas. And that is not something that is typically surfaced or that is incentivized under a clear futarchy model. And so like a very clear way to illustrate that is, let's say that you have a market for whether or not a project will be properly achieved by a certain deadline, and that market is set up for this idea. People within a company bet on whether or not the project will be achieved by a certain deadline. And let's say it's highly improbable, right? The market is pricing in a likelihood of 10 cents that, everything will be achieved by September. If you were to follow futarchy, then you would not go ahead and decide to allocate further resources to the project and maybe shift your attention elsewhere. But even though the probability of achieving the deadline is small, that might be a moonshot idea that's really worth taking. And so, yeah, you actually want to incentivize the creation of the decisions that are really moonshot and not doing the opposite. I think another interesting thing to surface here is that market-based decision-making algorithms don't actually incentivize the disclosure of important information. That might be a bit counterintuitive, but the best way to explain it might be that, yeah, of course, if I think that something is going to happen, and I see a market that isn't properly pricing that in, I might make a directional bet, and then reveal the information that I have as an individual point of data, to then make the market converge on my belief and make that money. But if I have a really important model, a scientific model of sorts, there is no real incentive for me to disclose to disclose that model in a market-based decision-making model. So I think that's some of the core problems with like decision markets and futarchy. And I think that like MetaDAO, which is a futarchy DAO on Solana, I think is dealing with like some of those issues. But I think that like there are other like challenges with market-based oracles, and that they still deal with the problems of reflexivity and hyperstition, which is essentially like what happens if you have a fiction that makes itself real. And you have examples of this happening in the past. I think there were prediction markets on politics where this happened with like the Mitt Romney election, for example, where all of a sudden you see people making bets in the prediction market to try to signal to the rest of the world that a politician is likely going to get elected, such that then people's confidence about that politician getting elected actually happen, and that that might be able to lead reality to where you bring it by making bets. And I think futarchists think that this is a bad argument, right? At the end of the day, a market has informed traders and uninformed traders, and if the probabilities of Mitt Romney actually getting elected are low, then they're going to counter trade these uninformed traders trying to manipulate the markets, and lose out. Um, the problem is that like the incentive for that informed trader to come in and actually correct the market are much lower when the duration of the market is very far out. However, the most valuable information to produce is the ones that are very far out into the future because they're more uncertain, right? And so there's this kind of like impossibility that gets created around the value of prediction markets in the context of decision making, and that the further out that they are, the more likely they are to be reflexive, and but at the same time, the more valuable they are in terms of producing a information that is valuable in terms of its predictive nature. And then the other part of it is it lacks generalizability. And so I forgot to go over the MetaDAO mechanism, but the TLDR of it is that proposals get executed as a function of whether or not the price of the MetaDAO token went up or down during the proposal's period of time, right? But is token price a generalizable enough oracle for positive outcomes? I don't think so, right? And I think that comes back down to the fact that like MetaDAO might have instantiated itself such that like the values of the people using it are aligned around token price, but to have a truly generalizable oracle for making good decisions, we need actually a way to come to consensus on what people's collective preferences are as part of the oracle itself. And then I think the other part of it that people ignore is like cultural and behavioral norms. I think people have this very like cypherpunk model of like, like we can just make decisions according to the market, and then the market will decide if the CEO should get fired or not. But people don't actually want to get judged by the market in such an aggressive way. People don't want to get a number put in front of them that tells them their likelihood or lack of likelihood to achieve something. And so there's this real cultural issue with market-based decision-making processes that I think many in the community actually ignore. And I think another part of it is information hazards, right? Going back to the idea of a hiring market, right? Let's say that you have access to a market on how likely it is that an employee will be a valuable employee, right? Do you really want that information to be public? Probably not, right? Because that's an information hazard that a competitor could then use to poach the potential employee. And so I think that that's why crypto might actually play a role, is like programmable information disclosure and cryptography in the creation of this information as well. I think another big thing that people think prediction markets will never be good at is that like, oh, like there's a lack of natural savers. And so, people in stock markets, pension funds enter to build wealth into stocks, right? But into prediction market, who's going to enter the market to build wealth? This is a big point in one of the most recent articles against prediction markets that I read. And I think this is probably solvable, like especially given the state of DeFi today. I don't see any reason why you couldn't build an index of prediction market contracts that serve as a savings vehicle where your returns are a function of, good traders that are making good bets across all these markets. I think another thing that people say is that most things that we might create a prediction market around aren't that much fun to bet on. I think generally this is a function of the user experience, but more broadly, a lack of flexibility in the market creation and resolution process. I think informally we always make bets about who's most likely to, and would you rather informally and not online. And there's no reason why this wouldn't be the case online as well. And then I think that like another part of it is people think these kind of like markets for predictive information won't work because you need cold hard cash to make them work. And I think that that's just not true. A lot of the research shows that you can have flexibility in terms of the skin in the game and the reward that you actually use to actually win in these markets. I don't know how much overtime I'm going, so I'm going to skip some parts here, but I think that monetization is another way we can improve things here. There are markets that we can create where the people that are actually betting in the markets don't actually have access to the outputs at the end of the day. So that might be one way of getting over some of the monetization problems of before, right? If we can limit the accessibility of the information that's produced from a prediction market, then maybe that's a tool that we can use to improve the supply chain. And I want to go to the negation game, which I think is actually a good oracle for decision making, because it incentivizes the collection of empirical consequential information, which we talked about as important, and it incentivizes the collection of empirical surprising information through epistemic leverage. And so maybe just to kind of explain how the negation game works to those that haven't had the fortune of studying it more deeply. In the negation game, participants stake their assets based on their predictions on beliefs. And when they encounter empirical evidence that contradicts their stake position, there is some sort of market mechanism to get them to voluntarily slash their own stakes. The incentive there is such that they can get additional influence in the algorithm, and that additional influence is granted as a function of how early they do it relative to others. And so I think that that's really cool because that self-slashing incentivizes the collection of consequential information. And I think that another part of it that is really cool is that it incentivizes the collection of surprising information. And so the way that that actually works is that participants can gain additional influence over what decisions are made by staking against their own preferred outcomes, but then also identifying counter arguments that could invalidate their position, right? So stating a counterfactual that will allow them to change their mind. And I think that if these counter arguments prove to be true, then they have to voluntarily slash their stakes. This mechanism operates on the principle that surprising and potentially falsifiable information holds high epistemic value. And I think that that's really interesting. And I think that we should further explore how to build this out. Another thing I've been thinking about is, and this is especially relevant in my role as a VC, is like, how can we add to these kinds of protocols? I think that like Ethereum is a great example of the fact that we figured out how to tokenize the value of an idea and then leverage that to enact change. And we're kind of taking this to the extreme at the moment with things like pump.fun and whatnot. And I think it's just pointing us towards the fact that we've done step one, like tokenizing the value of an idea through a token, and democratizing the ability to do that is actually not a bad idea. We just need better mechanisms to sustain that value and align it with the achieving of common goals. My intuition is telling me that there's some intersection here between this kind of an idea and the credit theory of money. But I haven't fully figured out the intersection. And so if anybody has any ideas in this regard, like, please let me know. So other speculative additions I'm working with is we can maybe improve information production and monetization with interesting, like, credible commitments on blockchain rails. And so there's this interesting idea of Bayesian markets, which is this idea that, like, in betting on what I think other people believe, I'm implicitly revealing private information about myself. That feels like a crazy cool idea to mess around with in crypto rails. There's certain information I might be embarrassed or not wanting to share. And I might only agree to share it if X of N of the participants also agree to share information and then maybe like bet on a market, maybe I would be more likely to contribute to the production information if I can get a credible commitment that its manufacturing process is done in a way that preserves my privacy. Maybe if I can get a credible commitment that a token representing my upside in the monetization of my information will, get minted in my wallet. I think these are all cool things to explore with, and I really think that like trust infrastructure around like cryptography, blockchains, DIDs, verifiable credentials are going to be somehow critical to doing this. I just haven't figured out exactly how. And I think this points towards, I think, my final slides here, which are that really a call for help to all of you, which is that I think that maybe, just maybe, we can use some of these concepts to have an alternative model to surveillance capitalism. Individuals need to better allocate resources, time, and energy to what we consume. And I think at the end of the day, advertisers and businesses that aren't Google, that use Google, would benefit from disintermediation. And I think that, like, yes, of course, these behavioral futures are bad, but how likely is it that we ban them? I don't know. Consumers are locked into this quid pro quo where they accept cheaper prices and they want personalization, and we trade that off for the right to change to influence our decisions, and that's terrible. But how might we solve the real like ethical problems of that without giving up personalization and cheap prices is just something that I really want to work on. And my sense of it is that there's actually a application bottleneck here and not a protocol bottleneck, and that we have to tackle things step by step. One of the big ideas in crypto VC at one point was decentralized identity and verifiable credentials, right? Let's aggregate private information into these sovereign DIDs and then allow us to programmatically disclose that information as we go across the internet. There's a massive cold start problem here. People don't actually want to be consciously issuing degrees and attestations to each other about, how good they are and what they might have done in the past. And I think that there are a couple things here we can leverage crypto and markets for to solve. If we can find markets that we naturally participate in because they're fun to participate in, where we like, again, to some this might sound dystopian, but like if we might like predict the behaviors of others naturally, as we might already do, or where we might be incentivized to import data about ourselves from the off-chain world. This is something that I think that like tokens and token incentives might actually be very well applied to. I don't think we should be scared to use them very aggressively here, because at the end of the day, they get rid of the cold start problem and can be used to a very important ethical ends. I think that importing data from the off-chain world into the on-chain world or into DIDs or stealth addresses is another way that we can get over the cold start problem, and that things like zkTLS could be really important here. And I think all this to say that like if we can find fun ways for people to import information, that's step one, right? But it's not actually an infrastructural issue, or I don't think you should start with a protocol level. And that these general purpose like DID platforms, I think did not succeed because of that. There's this massive cold start problem. Now that is just step one, right? To get to the point where a business can make a decision on what to advertise to a user based off of the information that they hold in a wallet. For that, we need inference. And to do that in a way that allows us to preserve the sovereignty over our information, but that might also give us the visibility into what kinds of models of us that others may have, we need things like verifiable computation and FHE. And that might still be a long way away. But we can start with importing information into DIDs and VCs, and finding like fun ways to do so. So Yeah, I think that the minimum viable protocols here, if we accept that behavioral futures aren't going to disappear, um, is that we need some way to allow these extreme asymmetries of knowledge to persist. Um, and we just need to find a way for advertisers to do so, whilst A, giving users a right to control the raw materials, and then B, the visibility into what kinds of models that advertisers might have of us, so that we can then um, decide to exit the system, right? To choose another algorithm um, that better aligns with how we want to allocate our resources. I think that might be something that might be enough if we can't ban like behavioral futures. Um, maybe just maybe we can shift to a monetization model where, because we have all these tools for producing information based off of credible commitments and like permissionless markets, that we can actually like find um, better connection and discovery, which is at the end of the day why we leverage tools like Facebook and Google. And if we can better coordinate towards those end, then we might be able to pay, we might be comfortable paying more. I don't know. I don't know how to assess the likely outcomes here. I don't know what I'm missing and what the future avenues of research would be. But these are all the kinds of jumbled concepts that I'm thinking through. And I'd absolutely love for everybody to recommend any future paths and brainstorm around where we might go from here. I'll pause there. Happy to answer any questions on what I might have missed. And yeah, thank you very much again for taking the time to listen to me.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Benji. That was a really thorough, in-depth look into your thought process here around information and its future usage. Some questions in the comments here. Some thoughts from Timber. His first comment saying basically like this talk is suggesting about turning ideas into stocks. Is that feel analogous to you, or is there some you have pushback on that?
That's a very interesting framing. I don't know that we would need to turn ideas into stocks specifically.
I don't think he's suggesting like the literal stockification of ideas, but sort of conceptually that, you know, if we're talking about monetizing specifically ideas and how they're spread and the behaviors that people are taking based on these ideas, is
Yeah,
that, you know, somewhat analogous to making a
yeah,
market for ideas.
yeah. I think if we, I'm trying to find a way to answer this within like the model that I've constructed to kind of like best do it scientifically. But like, if we conceptualize of like ideas as like, okay, like, what do we do? And I guess like that's what's being like, that's like ideas are kind of like decisions. Um, then like the stock analogy, I think, is like we can leverage stocks to like, I guess like markets, right? To surface like what um, ideas might be good or bad, um, and that those markets can produce information towards deciding what are good ideas or bad ideas. Um, but I think that like the ideas themselves don't necessarily have to be stocks. I guess it really just depends on your definition of an idea. In my model, an idea is an idea for a decision. You might want to leverage markets to produce information about what decisions to make. But the ideas themselves don't necessarily have to be stocks or like the markets themselves. I think one good example here is like you can use a like the hiring market, right? This is something that like Robin Hanson brings up all the time. Let's create a market on like who would be the best to hire. Let's run that internally. Great, you can improve decision making quality there. It's possible that you could implement that market such that at the end result, um, it's the end outcome of that market is being distributed to solely one key decision maker within the org. It's not distributed to anybody else, and that they use that to implement some some decision indirectly, but that like the idea isn't a market in and of itself. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think it makes some sense. Timber, if you're still watching, maybe add a follow up or something. A question from Dorian is: Are prediction markets inherently zero sum?
Um, yes and no. Um, most prediction markets today, like the ones we observe, like Polymarket, Manifold, Kalshi, they are binary options, futures markets that are zero sum, right? But they're only zero sum if you assume that there are no people that then extract further value from the markets in terms of its information quality, um, that might then be able to pay additional money to surface insights from that market. So, from the perspective of the trader is best betting yes or no, um, yes, the prediction markets are inherently zero sum. But from the perspective of somebody who might pay for the information produced from that market, they may be able to be contribute value into that market, that then shifts its dynamics and then changing it from something that's zero sum to non-zero sum. Um, Part of that is working backwards from the consumer, right? To make prediction markets non-zero sum, we need to go backwards from, okay, who are the consumers that actually need to like make good decisions? What information would they pay for? And if they have a high propensity to pay for information, then they should be willing to subsidize the production of information by a high dollar amount. And so I think part of my like rationale here for why I've approached it this way is like, how do we make prediction markets like non-zero sum is we need to work backwards from the consumers.
Awesome, thank you. I'll give one more minute for any last minute questions that want to come in. But otherwise, once again, thanks so much, Benji, for taking the time to chat with us today and giving us a good insight into some of the things that you're thinking about. And just end with a call to action for everybody who is watching this now or in the future. How can people get in touch with you in order to, further this conversation?
Yeah, happy to say it out loud, but also I have this like private chat feature on the should I use that as well?
The private chat will just come to me. So
Okay,
if you
okay.
want
Yeah,
to
yeah.
say it aloud, that is fine, unless it is something that
Sounds good.
you are wanting to keep more secret.
No, 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 not at all. So I'm just gonna send it to you as well, so you might have it on hand. But I'm available on um, Telegram at Benjamin_Funk. Feel free to reach out to me there. If you feel more comfortable with Twitter, feel free to reach out to me at 0xfunk. Um, I can also do email, where it's benjamin@archetype.fund. Yeah, feel free to reach out to me at any one of those places. I really, really want to talk to more people about these topics. And yeah, thanks again for taking the time.
Awesome. All right. Once again, thanks so much, Benjamin. I put that contact information in the YouTube comments, so get a hold of Benjamin there, and we will see you all next time on another Protocol Town Hall. Thanks again.
Thanks again, Josh.